So with that, I'd like to move on and let you, I'll take you on a trip to Fiji. And where is Fiji? Well, as you can see, it's down in the South Pacific. It's about exactly south from the equator as Hawaii is north. So we have pretty much identical weather to Hawaii, which isn't so bad. And what you're looking at here is just one of our collecting sites. We have a total of 7. This collecting site is about 9,000 square kilometers. As you see, about a good percentage of it is largely reef, shallow reef, and the diversity is just amazing. As you swim over the reef, you realize that how much of this coral is really appropriate for our trade? 1%, 2%, 100%? Well, you don't really see very much here that anyone, or especially myself, would consider shipping in a bag and hope to keep it alive for all of that time. Most of the coral is either too big, wrong species. If you try to collect some of that, you're just going to break it into bits. So what we really look for, it's a very selective harvest. And what we're really looking for are pieces that, are about this size, and that would be considered large. When our coral expert did the surveys, he estimated that on any given resource, we're only looking for about 0.001% of that resource is actually appropriate for our hobby. So, is there an alternative to satisfy the experts' criticism of our industry? Well, I'd like to point out a few alternatives because, by doing the right thing and involving yourself with the technology and the knowledge that's become available, and I really give credit to the hobby itself for, discovering ways to grow coral, which, all started in people's tanks, and when the lighting and the refugiums and everything started to become available, it really moved forward, and it gave me an idea in 1998 to start doing this commercially. And it's my wish that if 100% of this is what we ship, then why not? We can do it, we can provide it. What you're seeing here is some of the racks that we put in the ocean. We also experiment with some soft corals, even though it's almost silly to do. Soft corals grow so fast and they're so abundant. But what we did find is that the sizes and how they grow is nice and symmetrical and round, and you can't always find them that way in nature. And what you're looking at here is our what we call our frag mounts. We can make 1,500 of these frag mounts per day, and we do it with the same kind of material that we make our artificial live rock out of, which I'll tell you more about later. And when we make these large sandbox, and then we punch little holes down into them, and then we fill it with concrete so that we get this little peg and a little piece of miniature live rock. When these are done, we put them in the ocean for about 6 months. We neutralize the pH on them so the coral grows readily, and we actually have a miniature piece of live rock that we've man-made with a hole in the top, as you can see, and a peg on the bottom. And the peg has very useful purposes. It actually holds the coral into the rack in rough weather and so forth, and when it gets really rough, we can actually tie the peg to the racks by the use of wire. And we choose our sites very carefully. We make sure that we're on the right side of the reef, that we're not dumping these big, heavy, clunky rebar racks on a bunch of live coral. And when we have arrived at the site, we set the racks in the position that we want them. We also vary the height of the racks depending on the site that we're using. Here you can see the legs are pretty tall. You'll also see further on in some of the footage that they're only like a foot or two tall. We do all of the planting on the boat. This is our sea lab, and a boat called the Brittany, and it's big enough to have an entire lab on there. What you saw in the very first part of the video was our brood stock. We're now working on up to 3rd generation coral frags that we're using straight from our brood stock to continue to grow. Some of the pieces we find that after 2 years we can't do anything with it. It's this big, and so we use that to break down for the frags. Each one of these divers has been trained to carefully place the coral on the racks so that they don't grow into each other. Some of this is learned from mistakes we made in the very beginning, which I'll show you a little later, and also diversity. We want to make sure that if we're going after certain pieces that we can easily find them. Each rack, each site has about 50 of these racks on it, and again, we have 7 sites that we grow the coral on. And this guy's been holding his breath for about 10 minutes. Fijians are just wonderful in the water. We're also able to provide very useful studies, and we keep very accurate records of how the coral grows and what species grows, when it was planted, and its growth rate. We found that on different sides of the island, or different heights and different exposure to sunlight, the coral grows quite differently. Here you can see some of the broodstock that we've used. These corals are what I would consider too large to export. Seriatopora is probably one of the fastest growing corals that we found, which kind of took me by surprise a little bit. We also experiment with a lot of things that aren't the branching fast growing types. Here's some Turbinaria that we've tried, and I didn't believe it was going to work out, and it turned out that it did. They all grow nice and symmetrical and pretty, something that you'd like to see in your tank. When it starts out this small, they actually grow like nice big flutes. I miss Fiji. Not going to be there for about a month, but when you can take a dive in the water and see how all this stuff is growing and how wonderful it is, and know that you're actually taking part in something that could be the future of this entire industry. It's really important. This is the target species of what we're looking for. What you just saw earlier was how the size of the frags that we start out with. When they reach the size, depending on the species, it's about 6 months to a year. And again, diversity is the name of the game. We've actually trained other countries to do it the same way that we're doing it here. We've had Bali down and Indonesia. When we're close to resorts with our racks, we like to put signage on the racks so that the visiting divers and snorkelers can see what corals, why we're doing this, what corals are growing on the racks, and when they've been planted. This is our very first experiment, and when this film was taken, this coral was 3 years old. And today you cannot even see the rack. This rack was quite a distance from our facility, so we didn't get out there very often. And actually, we got out there about 2 years after we started it. And this is what we found, coral that we couldn't use. This is an experiment in the Solomon Islands with Dave Palmer. He started about the same time I did. And of course, you're all familiar with the Giant Clam Project. How'd you like to try to put that in your 20-gallon? And we've worked with coralomorphs. The only problem that we found with that is the attachment was a bit of a problem. They grow just nice, but they don't really stick to the rocks you want them to, so you can't come up with a good product for the hobby.